우리가 people
Well, thank you and welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary and I'm delighted to welcome you to Sister Act. You know, someone asked me when coming in tonight when I started researching this project, and I said I think I was 5 years old, and it's when I met my first nun. And actually, you know, naughty little boys and nuns don't always get along. And the punishment in my school, if you didn't behave, was the nuns, the good nuns, the lovely nuns, would bend your fingers back. So I want you to see my fingers. And they've gotten better with age. You should have seen them. I could almost touch my wrist a few years ago. So in any case, I've had a long history with nuns. I love them dearly. And you're seeing a show that's really quite remarkable. You know, there's the great question, what is better than a big, glitzy Broadway musical? And the answer is a big, glitzy Broadway musical with nuns. And let me tell you, these nuns have high bling. Remember on the last show that you just saw, you saw drag queens in a disco musical. Now you're going to be seeing nuns in a disco musical. So it's quite a remarkable range of events. Finally, we have a musical for saints and sinners. And warning, of course, this musical is habit forming. Now, I promise no more nun jokes. That's the end of my nun jokes. And most of them I couldn't tell you anyway, but in any case, we're here to talk about a really remarkable and delightful show. Let us go back to the beginning. This whole project started as an idea. So let me talk about an American humorist named Paul Rudnick. Paul Rudnick has been a very creative playwright. He's written a wide range of plays and films. And in 1987, he had the idea, since he spends his life thinking about comedy and how to develop comedy, and one of the major ingredients of comedy is always the idea of contrast and incongruity. And so it was his idea, really based on a real fact, that what would happen if a showgirl hid out in a convent. And of course, that would be the long journey of the making of first the movie of Sister Act, and then ultimately the musical of Sister Act. But even before we take that long journey, let me just share with you a very touching part of the story that no one ever really writes about. When Paul Rudnick had this idea, it was really based on fact. Keep in mind, most great ideas, of course, you know, we find them in the newspaper, we find them on the newsreel, but in some way something happens that triggers a very long creative journey, and someone writes a play or movie or film script based on that idea. In Paul Rudnick's case, it was based on the real notion of an actress named Dolores Hart, who in the 1950s was a very distinguished stage actress and also movie actress. She made 2 films with Elvis Presley. And at one point, she took Shakespeare's advice and said, "Get thee to a nunnery." And she left her career in Hollywood. I don't think it had anything to do with Elvis Presley, but she left her career and went to a convent. And she is now, a nun, has been a nun for over 50 years. And Paul Rudnick knew this story, and so he made a journey to the convent. Her convent is in Connecticut, actually Bethlehem, Connecticut, to see her. And at the time, this is 1987, the nun was having severe neuropathy and wasn't able to see him. But he was so struck by the idea of what a great comic idea of hiding a showgirl. I mean, it's really unfair to call Sister Dolores a showgirl. I mean, she was a very distinguished actress also in her own right. But the idea of taking a performer who's showy and obvious and absolutely the antithesis of what a nun is, and putting her in a convent. And so he used that idea, and from 1987 really until 1992, he worked on this idea of creating a story that would ultimately be known as Sister Act. Now, The Good Nun really had no reference to it other than being a good comic idea. None of the biography relates to her. But I do want to go back to this story later on about Mother Dolores because she does play a part in what happened in the opening of the musical in New York, but that's for later. Okay, so Paul Rudnick had this great idea, and he then worked with Scott Rudin. And Scott Rudin, of course, is one of the great producers, both stage producer, movie producer. I mean, he's A+, first class. He had a long association with the Disney Company. So they created this script called Sister Act. And the aim was to offer it to Bette Midler. And so for a long time, Bette Midler kept saying yes, no, maybe. And the end result was she finally turned them down, saying, none of my fans would believe I'm a nun. And that's perhaps a really true understatement, don't you think? So in any case, the end result was the show then, when it started going through the mechanism of Hollywood, ultimately everyone in Hollywood did a retake on Sister Act, and everybody kept turning it down. There were 6 script writers. Finally, Paul Rudnick got so disgusted with the project that even though it was his idea and substantially his script and his idea, the end result was that he took his name off the movie. It says the movie was written by Joseph Howard, and in fact, that's a nom de plume for Paul Rudnick. But 6 other writers had contributed ideas. But finally, what made the movie happen was Whoopi Goldberg read the script and said, this is dynamite. And she came on board, and then they hired really an all-star cast. Maggie Smith played the Mother Superior, and the film came out in 1992, keep in mind, 5 years after the initial idea, and the movie was such a success that it generated $230 million worldwide. There's a sequel called Sister Act 2 that's also a great delight. So if you've not seen those films, by all means go back and you'll have great enjoyment there. In the movie, what you have to understand is that they did use music. They used Motown music, existing music. So it was like a jukebox movie. And the end result was, it had world success and played everywhere in the world. Well, as you know, producers in the theater are always interested in looking at movies, and the answer is it's already had so much exposure. It's a commodity that has name value. I mean, if you do an unknown musical, you're fighting a very uphill battle because no one will have any reference to the title or the idea. But again, in the case of a successful movie, you've got the idea that the movie has a reputation, and that gives you a shot in the arm in creating the musical version of it. Okay, so now we jump to 2005. Producers gathered together and decide that perhaps it would be a good time to create a new kind of musical. And they went to the story of Sister Act, which people found so delightful. It was a very popular film. Just very simply, I'm not giving anything away. The showgirl named Dolores Van Cartier is sort of a nightclub singer, and her boyfriend is a gangster. You know all this in the first minute of the show. And she walks into his office and sees him kill someone. So she has to go into hiding, and she has fear for her life, of course. So the whole movie is about hiding and protecting herself. And of course, what better place for a showgirl to hide than in a convent, and that's the basis for the story. So the producers thought this was a good idea. But they decided instead of using the Motown music, the setting of the movie was in the 1990s, and it was set in Reno, Nevada, and it was also set at a convent in San Francisco. And so they decided that they really wanted to use Alan Menken as the composer. Now let me pause for a moment. Alan Menken is the most honored composer in the musical theater. He has 25 major awards. He has 8 Oscars for film scripts that he has done for Disney movies with music. So he has more Oscars than any living person, save for, of course, Walt Disney, who's deceased. But then he has a slew of Grammys, a slew of Emmys, and just recently, this past year, Alan Menken won the Tony Award for Newsies. So keep your ears perked up. Newsies is certainly a show that will find its way to Playhouse Square at some point. So he is, in some ways, the most honored composer in the musical theater. You most recently saw his work with Beauty and the Beast. So he writes very tuneful music. He started his career, Alan Menken, by writing a really brilliant show called Little Shop of Horrors, which is probably the most celebrated off-Broadway musical ever. And so the end result is he wasn't interested in doing a Motown musical because he did that with Little Shop of Horrors, and he didn't really want to compete with himself because that show now is a classic. So he talked the producers into changing the time of the show and the place of the show. So they moved the time from the 1990s to the late 1970s, putting us in high disco period. And then also he shifted it from taking place in Nevada to taking place in Philadelphia. Because keep in mind, in Philadelphia, in that period, in the late 1970s, there was a very big movement musically in Philadelphia that was called Philly Soul. And Philly Soul was a kind of very driving disco music that was a mixture of funk, rhythm and blues, and the wonderful driving beats of disco, sort of a la Donna Summers, that feeling. And so the end result was, it was a medium then and a period that Alan Menken had not worked with. Obviously, Disney doesn't have much interest in funky disco music, and so the end result was this was his opportunity to explore the canon of that very rich music in that period. So that was really a brilliant decision. The right composer, the right period, the right music. Now, I'd like to pause for a moment and go back to some of the origins of comedy, because I want you to see how really clever this musical is. Let's just go back 2,500 years before the birth of Christ for a moment and talk about, since this is a religious musical anyway, and talk about Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a work called the Poetics, and in the Poetics, he defined what comedy was. Now keep in mind, this is 2,500 years before the birth of Christ, and he's still accurate today. He said the major sources of humor are religion, sex, and politics. Boy, did he hit that right on the head. And his theory was also that comedy always comes from contrast. You want to put different kinds of people together. You want to put someone in a very strange or different environment. So the idea of incongruity, meaning you put the wrong person in the wrong place. The opera singer in a bowling alley, the sassy disco singer in a convent. You do something to create this sense of incongruity, and humor will come on every level. And that's exactly what happens with this show. Aristophanes went on to say that there are 6 elements of comedy: plot, character, thought, diction, music, spectacle. And basically what this means is that plot is how you tell the story. Now, I've given you the premise. The premise is a singer sees her gangster boyfriend kill someone. She goes into hiding. So the story is going to be about how she hides, where she hides, how they pursue her, how they try and find her. So watch how the story is told, how it moves from the nightclub to the convent. It moves to a bar. It moves to a police station. It moves to the disco bar again, and then it moves back to the convent and the church. So all of these environments keep changing all of the dimensions of how the story are told. So in the perfect Aristotelian way, this musical follows that idea. In terms of character, old Aristophanes all those years ago said, what makes a character interesting is that he changes. So watch that quality. Actors, when they talk about how they plot out their performance, talk about the arc of the role, how the character moves, how he develops, how he's tested, how he changes in the process of being put in this situation. So watch for that in the show. It's very cleverly done, literally with every character in the show. And it's fascinating to see how they change. So the strict mother superior with absolute values suddenly finds the humanity of the disco singer, and the disco singer finally finds the spirituality of the mother superior. It's a wonderful kind of evolution and a wonderful process of character development in the process of the way this show is developed. So watch for that in character. The word thought, when Aristophanes used the word thought, he meant what is the intellectual point that the show is making? And it's fascinating to watch. I mean, very early on, you watch the disco singer sing this very flashy, sort of arrogant song saying, "Aren't I fantastic?" And, you know, aren't I beautiful? My breasts are beautiful, my hair is beautiful, my voice is beautiful, I'm beautiful. And then you put that in contrast to the nun, who is so severe and abject and so without ego and without any sense of personal persona. And the end result is it makes for a fascinating journey and a fascinating sense of the thought ideas that evolve in the process of this show. And even though we have this delightful, light comedy going on for us, it starts moving us in rather deep ways. And the choices that characters start making near the end of the show are really quite powerful. So watch for the idea of how ideas are developed in the show. And again, it's always done comically, and it's always because we put the wrong characters in the wrong situation, and therefore we have humor. We come up with the phrase diction, meaning the language of the show. Of course, it's so wonderful here when you watch the sort of casual, offbeat street speech, the sort of patois that the nightclub singer uses versus the very correct, precise, simple language of the nuns. And then you watch how this sort of corruption happens and this transition happens in the course of the show. Watch an elderly nun in the show. I mean, finally she gets boogie in her soul, and it's really quite remarkable to see what happens to her in terms of how her language changes. I mean, Dolores, the central character, says to the nuns, "Wave your freak flag." Now, keep in mind, the freak in a nun is very deeply buried, I promise you that. And so it's very funny to watch how all of these ideas come out. Okay, so music. Aristotle meant music as everything that you hear in the theater. And keep in mind, Aristotle, when he was talking about the great Greek tragedies or the great ancient Greek comedies, they really did have music and singing and chanting. The word comedy comes from the word komis, which means goat song, which meant that it was a sort of takeoff on a religious song or chant that was parodied in some way. So the idea is that in terms of music, listen very carefully when you watch the show. It's not only the spoken language now, but listen very carefully to the quality of music that you're hearing. Alan Menken is a brilliant composer. So this wonderful mix of gospel and disco, and then you throw in a little funk, and it's really quite extraordinary, because then the juxtaposition and the contradiction of gospel versus disco versus funk all starts playing itself out in a very clever way, not only in the melodic aspects of the show, but also in the language of the lyrics of the show. So very cleverly done. And then finally, spectacle means everything that you see. So obviously, we're going to go from the church to the convent to the nightclub, and obviously they all have very specific atmospheres which you recognize and understand. I mean, the moment we walk into a church, we drop our voices and we whisper. The moment you walk into a nightclub, you start shouting because otherwise nobody's going to hear you. And so everything about the ambiance of these spaces will play out very significantly in the delight of the show. So it's so interesting that here we have this big, flashy Broadway musical that really stands up to the basic qualities that Aristophanes talked about, Aristotle talked about all those thousands of years ago. Okay, so here we are now. The movie has been a success. They're now ready to work on the musical. They're using all of those same formulas that were used in the movie, but they've got to create the musical. And Alan Menken is in charge by really setting the tone as the composer. They hire the writers of Cheers, very good choice. You want to find someone who's going to be the book writer who understands the pulse of popular taste And so they create then this musical called Sister Act. It first appeared in 2006 at the Pasadena Playhouse. I had the great pleasure of seeing it in the first week of its run at the Pasadena Playhouse. Incidentally, if you've never been to the Pasadena Playhouse, first of all, Pasadena is a delightful town in and by itself. It's a short drive from Los Angeles, and it's really worth seeing. It's a delightful town. But this theater is an historic theater like Playhouse Square, and many times in its history it's been in jeopardy of closing. And I went, not because I wanted to see Sister Act, but I went because I was so excited that there was a major project happening in that space and that it would mean there would be much more renovation. It turns out that Sister Act was such a success at the Pasadena Playhouse that it broke all of its box office records, and it infused a large sum of money which helped to create more of the restoration of the Pasadena Playhouse, which really delights me. The show then moved to the Alliance Theater in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, where it had another run, and that was in 2007. So all of this time, the show has been developed. Now, just let me tell you something about the cruelty of theater or any of the arts. The young woman who played the lead at the Pasadena Playhouse played it also at the Alliance Theater, and the critics went after her, saying, she really doesn't have the star quality to carry off the show. But what they weren't really understanding, keep in mind, critics are not all-knowing. And in this case, what was wrong with the show was not the star. What was wrong with the show was it didn't really end. And watch for a number in the second act. It's called The Life I Never Led. And it's sung by a young novice, a young girl in the story who was really dropped off at the convent at birth and grew up with the good sisters. And so she isn't really a nun, but she's in great conflict, spiritual conflict about how she should live her life. And so she sings this brilliant song in the second act called The Life I Never Led. And what happened in Pasadena was they didn't know that that number would be such a showstopper, and it was, but the tragedy was it wasn't given to the star because obviously Dolores Van Cartier had lived life, probably much too much, but the end result was that the show suddenly went out of focus because the great song was given to a minor character. That same thing happened in the Addams Family. In that musical, and Nathan Lane went ballistic because it wasn't his number, and it wasn't out of ego, it was because he knew that the focus of the show would go out of focus because it wasn't on him. So the end result was that was what was really wrong, both in at Pasadena and in Atlanta, but they weren't able to quite come up with fixing it. But let me assure you, they really did fix it. And just watch those numbers beyond that show-stopping number. They each top that number in their own special way. So they were able ultimately to get the show really into focus and to give it back to the star. Okay, so the show was optioned then for a production in England. Now, let me tell you another interesting story. The composer of the show, Alan Menken, as he was writing it, was invited to the mayor of New York's party for the arts at Gracie Mansion. And every major artist in New York was there. And they asked Alan Menken to get up and they said, "Would you play something for us? What are you working on?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm working on a new musical called Sister Act." And all of a sudden, from the audience, he heard this raucous, "What? What are you doing?" And it was Whoopi Goldberg, who had no idea that a musical was being made. And she said, "Whoa, I want to know about this. That's it's not really her property, but if she felt very paternal about the show." So Alan Menken got the focus back on him. He played the numbers and everyone was very polite. And finally now, they're ready to do the show in London, and they really can't quite raise all the money. So very smartly, Alan Menken remembered that Whoopi Goldberg had this very strong maternal feeling about this show. So they contacted her, and she became the lead producer on the show. As you know, Bette Midler did the same thing in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and as you know, Oprah Winfrey did the same thing with The Color Purple. So it was the star producer that made the difference. So when the show went to London, Whoopi Goldberg started adding a lot of influence. Tragically, the woman who had played the lead role in the two tryouts was fired from the show. But ironic story, they spent a year trying to find the right young black woman who had the chops to sing the role and the charisma and personality to play the role. You know, everyone is still remembering Whoopi Goldberg. Of course, most of all, Whoopi Goldberg was remembering herself, right? So the end result was that they went back and they remembered a young girl who was the understudy in the original production in Pasadena and in Atlanta. But meanwhile, you know, 3 years have passed, and that young girl really developed vocally, and she was cast in the role, and she played the role both in London and in New York. She was nominated in London for the Olivier Award, and she was nominated in New York for the Tony Award. So that's really a kind of wonderful success story for a young artist coming from nowhere, really one of her first jobs being an understudy, and then, you know, being thrust into the star role. Okay, so the show had a wonderful life in London for 1 year. The audiences loved the show. And just a Whoopi Goldberg footnote, Whoopi Goldberg was too old to go in and play the sassy cabaret singer, so she went in and played the Mother Superior. Now, I would swim to London to see her do that. Anyway, apparently she was brilliant, and she played it for a short period of time, and then she decided that the show should move to New York, but she also felt there were still things wrong with the show. And so she took over in a very strong way. They fired the director, they fired the choreographer, they fired the designer, and you know, so this caused great chaos in the process. And she then hired a new director, Jerry Zaks. He's a major Broadway director, and she had worked with him on a show called Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It starred Nathan Lane, and it was a great success. When they went to replace Nathan Lane, they said they're going to have to close the show because who could stand up to the star power of Nathan Lane? And it was Jerry Zaks who said, well, I think Whoopi Goldberg would be brilliant. Well, we'll play the slave as a woman instead of a man. And Whoopi Goldberg was brilliant in that, you know, when she replaced Nathan Lane in the show and gave it a whole new life. So she had a great regard for Jerry Zaks. So she hired him as the director to try and help fix the problems. Now, keep in mind, the book writers who had, you know, the authors of Cheers and major television credits, she fired them and said, you know, we've got to refine these characters. And so they hired an American writer named Douglas Carter Beane. He wrote a wonderful play called Little Dog Laughed. It played at Obama Theater recently. And he has a show that's just about to open in New York, actually, called The Nance, and it's starring Nathan Lane. So this will be his big explosion as a playwright. So he was hired. They worked on this project, reconceived it, changed order of musical numbers, defined characters more specifically, and the show opened in New York basically to rave reviews. So it's a show that's had a long history, going all the way back to an idea. I want to bring back Mother Dolores for one moment and tell you that the actress who played Mother Superior in the original Broadway production felt very insecure 3 days before the show opened. And so she remembered the story that Paul Rudnick had told her about wanting to meet Mother Dolores. So she went to Connecticut and was able to meet with her. And Mother Dolores said to her, don't make the nun too pious, make her human, which of course they had already done in the way the story was developed. And also she said, you know, have fun in your sense of humanity. And of course she could give very good advice because she was a Tony-nominated actress herself. So that was inspired to go to the nunnery to get advice about how to play the role. The end of that story is that all of the nuns from the nunnery were invited to come to the opening of Sister Act in New York, which really delights me, and they put their blessing on the show, which makes us all very happy. So the end result is you're going to see the ultimate nuns with bling, and I hope you have an experience that will put boogie in your soul. Thank you very much.
There she is, folks. The queen of the scene, the diva with the fever.